Hello to everybody. Joanne Freeman here again. Welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. And I'm going to show you my coffee in a moment, but I'm keeping you in suspense. I saw a note from somebody who totally guessed the mug trick, but I'll wait till I show everyone. As I've said before, what I'll be doing here every Thursday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Coast time, West Coast time is wrong. Eastern Standard Time. I'm a little over caffeinated this morning, is talk about a document or a person or an event or something from the past that I find either surprising or interesting or powerful or something, and then I'll plunge into it and talk about what it shows us about the past and then how it can offer us assistance in thinking about analyzing the present. So before we plunge in, actually, I need to introduce my partner in crime, Matt Messias, who is going to offer you some ground level rules for asking questions, because after I speak my piece, then there will be time for us to talk to each other.
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Matt Messias, if you don't remember me from last week. I'm the education coordinator for National Council for History Education, and we're really proud to be able to work with Joanne in this and lean on her expertise. And she's a dynamic speaker, and so we're so excited for these. Couple ground rules for today is, again, if you want to share your location, it's always nice to see where everybody's from. You can put that in chat. Also, if you have any general comments, keeping it academic and clean and all that good stuff, because this is a family program. You can do that in chat as well. If you have questions, though, for Joanne, when we'll do a Q&A session towards the end of the session today, put that in the Q&A section of the webinar. That way we can scroll through those. You can do those throughout, but we'll promise not to do anything until the very end. We also got some feedback last week that things were too short for everybody. So we're going to go about an extra 15 minutes, I think, today. Go about 45 minutes to 10:45 or so. And so we'll have a little bit extra time for questions. So that's it from me. I'm going to turn it over to Joanne, and I'm going to minimize myself so you get to look at her and you don't have to look at me.
Now, before I plunge into what I really want to talk about, I have to say, so Matt has put up behind himself, a place. He planted himself in a place. I can't remember the word for that because I'm not technologically gifted, but there's a background behind him. And it went up, and he can attest, in -2 seconds, I said, "It's Hamilton's office." So I love the fact that he put it there. And I love the fact that I was like, bam, I know where that is.
Got it right away.
That's hilarious. Okay, but let's get to the subject at hand. I want to talk about a document this morning that I find particularly powerful and really revealing, and that ended up revealing a lot to me in the process of thinking through the book that I just published, or recently published, The Field of Blood, which is about physical violence in the US Congress. Now, before I plunge into the document and look at what it says and then what it shows us about the past and present, I'm going to offer two kinds of background this morning. So first, I want to talk just a little bit about how I found the document and how I came to realize it was important. I didn't do this last week, but from time to time, I am going to talk about the how of history, how we do the work of history. And this is one example of that, because I think content is important, but so is how we find it. And then after I talk about how I found it, then I'm going to talk a little bit about the document itself, what it says, and then what it reveals. And then I'll pivot at the end to make a present day connection. Okay, so first, how I found it. I was working on my book on congressional violence, The Field of Blood, and I was looking for congressional violence, which is very logical. A lot of it's hidden, so I had to do a lot of digging. And one of the places that I went digging was in the personal papers of congressmen. Newspapers often didn't include it. The congressional record said barely anything about it, but in personal letters, often to their wives, congressmen would talk about what they saw and often what they felt while they were in Congress. So that became an important source. And so a lot of what I did at the beginning of this project was bounce from congressman to congressman to congressman, looking at their papers, collecting evidence, looking for something that wasn't necessarily conventional political evidence, right? There wasn't a petition or a vote count or something, but really looking for something more personal so that it might have some evidence of what really was going on at the ground level at the time. So I came across this document. It was in the papers of Simon Cameron. He was a Republican politician from Pennsylvania who was in Congress in the late 1850s. And there was a lot of interesting stuff in his papers that I had no use for. You know, there were petitions. There was some kind of weird, what I assume must be an electoral, like a paddle that you wave around in support of a candidate. There was all kinds of interesting stuff. But then I came across today's document, and that stopped me. Because immediately, even before we plunge into the meaning, you can see when you look at the document, first of all, it says memorandum. So immediately you think, ooh, okay, this isn't just some formal something being said for the public, it's a memorandum. So why is this being written? There must be a purpose. And then I looked just briefly at the document and I saw lots of emotion, right? I saw frantic with rage and shame and attacking our manhood and all of this really dramatic emotional language. And then, of course, I looked and saw, ooh, it's signed by 3 congressmen from the period I'm studying. So it certainly showed me that whatever this document was about, even without plunging into the context, there was a lot of emotion in it. And part of what I was interested in studying violence in Congress was the emotion of it, right? What's the emotion? What causes people to inflict violence on others or threaten people? And then how do people react to that? And how does that affect the actual playing out of politics in Congress? So I knew this document was going to do it, along with a lot of other evidence. But I do want to say for a moment, because emotion is not a typical kind of evidence that we look for when we're doing political history. And obviously there are a lot of ways to approach political history. This is one of many, and I'm not the only person to do this, although it's kind of at the center of what I do. I'm really interested in the emotion of ground level elite politics. What are the emotions that are driving people to act in a certain way or not act in a certain way, right? What can you tell about what they're feeling, and what does that show you about what they feel they can and can't do? Now, the important part of looking at that kind of evidence is you can't assume, as tempting as it is, that all emotions are always the same across all time, because they're not, right? Emotions are shaped by culture. Culture changes. So I can't say, ooh, they look mad. I thus understand the anger. I can say, oh, they look mad. What does that mean in that time period? What language are they using? What makes other people mad? There are a lot of people becoming mad in that way. So I have to place it in context. But emotion can be a really powerful tool in getting down at the ground level and understanding the human dynamics of politics, which can shape political action, in my case, in Congress, as much as sometimes the formal purpose of a bill or some kind of discussion or debate going on in Congress. Personal emotion can drive people to do things one way or another. I'm going to talk in a little bit about the emotion in this letter. One of the things I'll be talking about is bullying, which is at the core of this letter and which shows you one really useful thing, one example of how emotion can really show you ground level political dynamics in a way that is not necessarily easy to see otherwise. Okay, so emotion lets you look at kind of the humanity of the past and how that shapes politics. I'm really interested in that stuff. You have to decode an often alien culture and kind of dig down and understand what people are feeling and how it shapes them. And to me, that's fascinating, to decode an alien world and to try and see through people's eyes and try and understand what they saw as their range of possibilities. I'm always interested in that. Okay, so let's now look at the what of the document. Moving papers around here. Okay, so first off, you look at the document and what is it? And I mentioned already, it's a memorandum. So that's interesting. It's not a letter to someone. It's not a newspaper article. It's unclear why it's a memorandum, but it is. Then you look and you see, okay, so who signed the memorandum? Because you wouldn't necessarily assume 3 people would sign essentially a memo. In this case, there are 3 congressmen who signed it. Simon Cameron from Pennsylvania, Republican, is one of them. Benjamin Franklin Wade, a Republican of Ohio, is another one. And Zachariah Chandler, great 19th century and 18th century name, another Republican from Michigan. The 3 of them are the ones who signed the document. So, okay, I see that there are 3 Republican congressmen. They were all in Congress in the late 1850s. Fascinating. So what does this actually say? Okay, so when you start, let me get the document here. And I will say too, so there were Republican congressmen in Congress in the late 1850s. I'm going to come back to the Republican Party, but what's important to realize as I read from this is the Republicans came on the national stage in the mid-1850s as an anti-slavery party, right? A basically northern anti-slavery party. And it was the first thing of its kind. Parties tended to be, cross-national. This was something different. It wasn't an easy thing to do, and I'll come back to that, but all of these men fit into that category. So they came in sort of at a moment where it mattered that they were showing up. Okay, so in the memo, I'm just going to read the first couple sentences and a few others, but this is the very beginning of it. During the 2 or 3 years preceding the outbreak of the slaveholders' rebellion, which is the Civil War, little dig right there. During the 2 or 3 years preceding the outbreak of the slaveholders' rebellion, the people of the free states suffered a deep humiliation because of the abuse heaped upon their representatives in both houses of Congress. This gross personal abuse was borne by many because the public sentiment of their section would have fallen with crushing severity upon them if they had resorted in the only manner in which it could be effectively met and stopped, by the personal punishment of their insulters. So they're saying we were being humiliated on almost a daily basis by these Southerners, and the only way to respond would have been with physical violence. They even at a certain point go on to talk about dueling. And Northerners, our constituents, might not be thrilled that we did that. So we sat there and we took it because we didn't think that that would be the right way to respond. They go on to note how difficult it was to take this. They note on one occasion how they became, quote, frantic with rage and shame, which is a wonderful phrase. And then they note that on one noted occasion, Robert Toombs, another congressman, indulged in such terrible and unjust denunciation of William Seward, another one, and his followers, that the undersigned, the people in the memo, felt themselves forced to do something to vindicate themselves and their constituents, threatened through these means with a denial of equal representation in the Senate. Okay, so that's important. They're feeling that because they're being bullied and silenced, their constituents aren't getting proper and full representation. So not only do they feel personally humiliated, but they feel personally humiliated because the process of representation, their duty in Congress, is being cut off. So they go on and say, we consulted long and anxiously, and the result was a league by which we bound ourselves to resist any repetition of this conduct by challenge to fight. Challenge is a word to notice here. And then, in the precise words of the compact, the agreement they made at the time, quote, to carry the quarrel into a coffin. Okay, so that's dramatic. That's saying that we finally became so infuriated by being insulted and silenced by these Southerners and so outraged that our constituents were being denied full representation because of it, that we began to feel we needed to do something. And then there was an episode that was so insulting that we went away, the three of us, and talked to each other and decided, well, something has to be done. And we're going to fight fire with fire, challenge, suggest that there might be dueling involved in this. And so they're basically making a kind of dire commitment here. This is not the way they normally would behave. And when you go on further into the letter, the next paragraph, you see that they assumed that they probably would be ostracized back home for doing this. And ostracism is galling as the endurance of the insults we encountered in the pursuit of our public duty. So they are assuming that Northerners aren't going to like what they do, but it doesn't matter at this point. They're going to defend their constituents and themselves and their party by confronting insults, by being willing to fight back. That's a really powerful document. And, you know, they say at the end of the second main paragraph of it, they wanted to make it known that some Northern senators were ready to fight for sufficient cause. Okay, put that here because I'm going to come back to it. Okay, so that's really interesting, and particularly interesting when you put it in context. So before the 1850s, and definitely before the mid-1850s, there had been a pattern in Congress, and it's the pattern that I had been uncovering as I was doing my research. The pattern was that Southerners would intimidate and bully Northerners to protect Southern rights, often about slavery, not always, but the pattern was Southerners would use threats or intimidation or, you know, threaten to humiliate Northerners in one way or another, silence them through intimidation. And a lot of Northerners sat down and shut up rather than confronting that, not because they were weak and cowardly, but partly because in their mind, they were defending their party. And if we stepped forward into this debate, and in the case of slavery, made slavery the center of debate, it would divide our party, it would be a horrible thing. Let's just keep things calm, right? This is the maneuver, this is the constant sort of political negotiating that kept slavery off the table for a very long time. Everyone always saying, oh, no, let's not discuss it now, until finally, as we're going to see in a moment, some people said, no, actually, now, let's talk about it now. So there's a long pattern of Southern bullying and Southerners basically putting up with it and shutting up and sitting down. This document is saying, okay, different kind of Northerner here. And they actually, when you look at the congressional record, Republicans in Congress at this moment, that's precisely what they would say. They would be attacked by a Southerner, and then they would stand up and say, different kind of Northerner here. We're not going to sit down. We're totally different realm here. We Northerners, and largely the Republican Party, an anti-slavery party, were coming in on a whole different level with a whole different dynamic. They ran the Republican Party in part. One of their slogans was that they were dedicated to fighting the slave power. And in Congress, where they were face to face, side by side with Southerners, fighting the slave power sometimes had a physical edge. So that's part of what's being discussed in this document. We're looking at three congressmen who feel humiliated or felt humiliated at the Southern abuse, who decided they're Republicans, they're a different kind of Northerner, they don't care what's going to happen because of it. They're even willing supposedly to die because of it, but they're going to step forward and fight because they just can't stand it anymore. And the pledge talks about they're defending their manhood, they're defending the rights of their constituents. So what you see in this document is not only a really interesting fact, right? Oh, Southerners are bullying and the Republican Party comes in and they fight back. That's an interesting fact. But you're seeing the inner dynamics of that, right? You're seeing the impact of the Southern bullying. You're seeing the emotional response of these men and how they decided to act because of the emotion and impact of the current moment. So what you're seeing is a kind of ground level understanding of how politics on the floor of Congress was playing out, right? Why did Northerners not confront Southerners so often? Well, other documents show them saying, this guy's a dueling guy. I'm going to sit down. I don't want trouble. In this document, these Republicans who enter Congress as an anti-slavery party, they're saying, no, we're going to stand up. And in part because we can't bear this anymore. So when you look at what's going on in Congress and you see these men stand up, you understand what it took for them to do that, what they wanted the emotional response to be on the other side. They want the Southerners to feel like, whoa, what's going on here? And you can understand the power of this tool that Southerners are using, right? And that's one of the things that, generally speaking, is interesting to me. Southerners were using, in a sense, emotion as a tool. And I'm going to come back to this. You know, I said today I'm going to talk about feelings, I'm going to talk about emotions, but I'm not just talking about, wow, you know, aren't feelings strong. I'm actually going to be talking about, and have already started, about emotions as a political tool, about people using emotions to get what they want. Bullying is one example of that, and that's actually the word that people used at the time to describe Southerners who were particularly famous and aggressive in this kind of politicking. They were called bullies from that moment. So that's showing you, you know, again, the dynamic is these bullies step forward and they silence their opponents, and Congress sort of burbles along. You're seeing a level of logic through looking at emotion about what's going on in Congress that you couldn't see otherwise. So in a way, it's allowing you in some way to begin to understand how these people saw their world and the kinds of possibilities they had in the place where they were in the realm of politics. Okay, and I will say too, as I mentioned before, this is one of the things that's distinctive about the kind of history I do. I'm fascinated by trying to climb into the heads of people in the past, allowing them to stay in the past. So not assuming that because someone is angry in the past, I understand that anger, I get angry too, right? Instead, I'm saying, ooh, he's really angry. Why? And does that same sort of thing make other people angry? And what does that show us? That's a really interesting form of evidence to look for. And as I suggested before, the fact that it shows emotion as a deliberate tool being deployed by people to get a certain result, that's not the way we tend to think about emotion or emotion in politics. Okay, so that's the logic of the document. To me, it still is, obviously. I'm like flailing my arms all over the place. It's an incredibly powerful document because of the personal testimony in it, right? And that's the sort of thing that when you see that kind of a document, it's like historian nirvana. Oh my gosh, it's three people attesting to what it felt like. And you have to think about, as I said, where they are and who they think is reading it and any number of other things. But that kind of evidence isn't necessarily all that common and is really powerful. Before I pivot and talk about a little bit about how to apply that to today, I do want to mention something at the end of the document because it's the last bit of emotional evidence, and it's part of why the document means something to me above and beyond its power as evidence. So they do this memo, they all sign it, they actually made 3 copies, they planted one in the papers of each of the 3 signers. I've seen 2 of the 3. So clearly they're doing something formal. And at the end, they say, "We have drawn up and signed this paper as an interesting incident for those who come after us to study, as an example of what it once cost to be in favor of liberty and to express such sentiments in the highest places of official life in the United States." That, I say this at the beginning of my book, it's still, that just brought tears to my eyes because they're saying we wrote this down because we want future people to understand what it meant to oppose slavery on the floor of Congress. And what they're showing is the experience of it, what it felt like and what it drove them to. And they're doing it for us, right? For people after us to study. So when I first read that document, it was almost as though they were saying, we wrote this down so that people like you, Joanne, can understand what's going on in the past. What a powerful thing to do. And for a historian, the sort of thing that knocks you back in a wonderful kind of a way, but that's a special document to me. Okay, before I open things up for questions, which I'll do right away, more moving of papers. Okay, I wanna pivot a little bit to emotion in the present and why I'm talking about this particularly today. Now, I will say that I pondered different topics for History Matters, and so does coffee, weeks before, right? When I first thought of this idea, I began to write down ideas. And when Matt and I were putting together the logistical components, I always said this was going to be the second topic. The first topic was going to be contingency, which is in a way the starting point for understanding history. And the second point was going to be emotion as evidence. Now, of course, we're in a week where there's a lot of emotion for all kinds of reasons on all sides, right? I am certainly feeling emotional this week. I'm assuming a lot of you out there are too. So it happens to be coincidence that this is happening in this week. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of emotion floating around in the political realm and us as well. What I would encourage people to do, and this document kind of shows you the benefits of doing that, it's really easy to get caught up in the emotion of the moment when you're talking about politics or political rhetoric, right? It's sometimes some political rhetoric isn't just a thing being said. Sometimes it's something being said deliberately to provoke an emotional response in the people hearing it, right? That's part of how propaganda works. But generally speaking, sometimes some politicians are saying what they're saying to get an emotional response, which will help them to get the concrete response that they want. When we are out there in the world, listening to what people are saying, looking at what they're doing, it's really useful before we respond to pause for a moment and think about what's happening in that moment. Is this person trying to make me mad? And if so, why? Also, why am I getting mad? What does it show us? But really interrogating a moment. What is this person trying to do by saying this? And what does that show me about the dynamics of the moment? We should think about emotion and the way we're responding to events and the way in which politicians of all kinds are expecting us to respond. We should compute that into the way we understand the present, because it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's people refusing to do something or insisting on doing something because they're afraid, or they're not afraid, or they feel bullied, or they are bullies. But in one way or another, this moment is really, I don't know, neck deep in the power of emotion and the power of what it can do. And I think that's a useful insight as we're churning through what we're churning through now. Okay, I went on a little longer than I did last time, but I am now gonna take questions. Someone asked at the very beginning, what is the mug for this week? Feelings. That was the best I could do. It's feelings on a mug. I also wanna say one thing before we plunge in. I just saw someone say, why is it dated later? It's dated in the 1870s. These guys sit down in the 1870s and then recall back about the 1850s. When I first found it, I tried to figure out what in the 1870s inspired this. And as far as I could tell, there was a civil rights-ish bill that had just been voted down in Congress. And like right after that, these guys come along and make this document. So, you know, the absolute purpose of it is less important to me than what it shows. But it is suggesting that at a moment when things were not playing out the way these guys wanted, they sat down and thought back to the original fight and how much that fight meant, and how what was happening now wasn't necessarily living up to what they wanted to happen then. So that's, I think, the logic of the date. Okay, now I will shut up and open things up for questions.
That is super helpful. Thank you, Joanne. I'm guessing there's virtual applause everywhere because that was incredibly moving. So yeah, so a lot of the initial questions were about the date and sort of why they waited 20 years to write this, and you know, and you addressed that. So I actually want to kind of start with one that's a little further down. I find really fascinating. Lindsay Marshall writes, how do we think well about the performative role of emotion in situations like this letter about either one, cynically discrediting the expression of pure calculation, and two, uncritically accepting the expression of emotion as a representative of the feelings of the politicians expressing it?
Okay, that's
I know there's a lot there, so just comment however you feel.
No, but that's a really important question. And I talk about that question with my students all the time. It's tempting, and what I just said in a way is sort of pushing you in that direction. It's tempting to assume that all political rhetoric is just rhetoric. All political rhetoric is just blah, 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 blah. I want what I want, and I'm going to say this to get it. Some political rhetoric is blah, 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 I want what I want. But not all political rhetoric is that. And that's when the skills of a historian become important, right? You have to think about why people are saying what they're saying, who they're saying it to, who they think the audience of it will be, how big that audience is, how what they're saying lines up with things they've said elsewhere. You really have to interrogate that moment. Sometimes, you know, if someone stands up in front of a crowd and says something, they might mean it in some ways, but they're also definitely thinking about how the crowd is going to respond. You have to understand the person in the moment to get at the balance of that. Sometimes it's really clear. I mean, I teach my students that when you're looking at a personal letter from this time period, I think I mentioned this last time, one thing to look for is how the letter is moving from one place to another. If it's dropped in the mail, then the assumption is that a lot of people are going to see it. And so what's in it won't be very personal. If it's delivered from one man to another man, then we're talking about something more personal and more private and maybe more sincere, but that holds true for rhetoric as well. So there's not, I can't draw a line about that, but as tempting as it is to dismiss all political rhetoric as just purpose-driven and shallow, it isn't. But we really have to analyze the moment to understand that. And I guess part of what I'm saying today is when we're thinking about that, we need to pause first to think about that, right? What is this moment? What's happening here? Why might this person be saying this? And how much does it show us about what this person consistently thinks? How much might it be born of a burst of anger at the moment? And how much of it seems kind of calculated? I think all of those things can be true. But I think we need to think about that, and I don't know if we always do. So not a clean answer, but a really smart question, because it's not always false rhetoric and it's not always purely meaningful. That requires smart historical questions.
Thank you so much. So there's a number of questions also about William Seward and sort of his role, or him just being a part of this reflection that they wrote. Can you speak just a little bit more about William Seward in the context of this memorandum? And if you can speculate, if you can't, that's totally understandable, but if you could speculate maybe how he might have been viewed in light of what these three congressmen are writing.
Right. So, and he comes out, I didn't read necessarily the passages that have something to do with Seward, but before they launch into frantic with rage and shame and insulting our manhood, one of the things that they say is Seward was our leader in Congress, and he was being insulted all the time, and he was kind of taking it. And there's even, let's see if I can pick this up again. There's this incredible, all men of spirit, all Republicans in the Senate, men of spirit, were insulted through him. And that's very consistent in this period, that one way to insult a party was to totally humiliate a leading figure in it. And that's part of what's going on here. And then they go on and say, whether from philosophical serenity of temper or from a positive lack of physical courage, he took these premeditated insults with a calmness which set many of his followers frantic with rage and shame. So he is taking this stuff, he's serving that role. He clearly, in some way or another, is in a more negotiating or mediating kind of a role that a lot of people, including these people, just can't stand. And eventually, when they decide to do something different, they make a private deal, right, with each other. They make a pact with each other to do this, despite what Seward is doing, despite what Northerners have done in the past. So you certainly see him in this document as the leader, as a leading figure that he was. You see how his behavior had bigger repercussions than just on party politics. It had repercussions on how his party operated and what they thought of themselves, and they're suggesting what others thought of the Republican Party because of Seward. But Seward is practicing a distinctive kind of politics. These guys are saying maybe he's just a coward, or you could say he's doing something deliberate for a reason. This gets back into the realm of how you have to deploy your historian skills to start to tear that apart and understand it better.
And so there's a really interesting question here. So what were these three were these three still congressmen in the 1870s, or were they private citizens, or what were they doing when they were writing this?
If I remember correctly, 2 of them were in Congress. 1 of them was not.
Okay.
And so again, it's been years since I did this. Document stands out because obviously, oh my gosh. But as I remember, 2 of them were in Congress, 1 was not, and the 3 of them got together not long after this bill was defeated. So, which again leads me to think that it's about something more than just, oh darn, a bill got defeated. They've called this third party in to meet with them as well.
Fantastic. So there's one question here which I'm going to answer because I can answer it.
Okay.
Which is there a link to last week's recording? And the answer is yes. We will be hosting these. We're recording every episode, and you can go to nche.net/conversations. And you can have access to all the documents and all the recordings. They usually go up. Give me about 24 hours to download it and make it look as pretty as we can and put it back up. So on to more questions. So this is I love this question because I think it gets at the heart of what K-12 teachers are doing. And maybe you can help this, given the idea of emotion. It's from Matthew McMichael. It says, do you have any tips for discerning emotion in primary source images? Specifically, or primary sources generally even. I'm going to add on to Matthew's question here. But any tips for discerning emotion in primary source documents, particularly images? He's working with middle schoolers, and it's finding it challenging.
Okay, so I'll offer 2 answers. One is cartoons can be one way to do this in a maybe more accessible way, because cartoons are all about making fun of someone or insulting someone or praising someone. So you can show someone a cartoon and say, what is this cartoon like? Does this guy look good in this cartoon, or does he not look good in this cartoon? And so what does the cartoon seem to be saying would be one way of getting at what a cartoon is supposed to be provoking. Another way is, and I do this with my students all the time, when I talk about like 1792 and the period when Republicans and Federalists, and particularly Hamilton and Jefferson, began really banging up against each other, and they read a whole collection of letters from that moment. And one of the first things I ask them is, what did those letters make you feel? And I don't want a sophisticated answer. I don't want a, Republicanism answer. I want, what was your gut response? And I get one, right? And it isn't sophisticated. It's like, sounds like high school, right? Sounds like people complaining because he was my friend first and now he's his friend. It sounds like high school. It's like, okay, what does that suggest? Let's move with that. Sounds like high school. Well, that is kind of what's happening here, isn't it? So I think sometimes inviting people to have a gut reaction that isn't necessarily a smart reaction, but that opens the door to that kind of conversation can be really useful and really powerful.
Thank you very much. We're doing okay on can we even go maybe another 5 minutes? Is that going to be okay? There's some great questions here. So a couple of people asked about emotion in the current climate, which we're trying to avoid because this is not because it's just loaded, but because we're trying to be as historical as possible. And oh my goodness, I lost the question. Hang on.
Okay, I will drink from my
You take your coffee. Give me 1 second. So John Charles asks, he frames it in a way about the current climate, but I'm going to ask the sort of first part of the question, which I think we can talk about in a more historical sense, which is, it seems that certain periods in our history and our political climate encourage more raw emotion than others. He asked a question about the current climate, but given that, can you talk about that sort of phenomenon that certain periods in our history and our political climate encourage more raw emotion than others?
Yeah, I certainly can. I'm going to be talking in broad historian talk. So you're going to be able to say like, well, what about this? Well, what about this? But there is a pattern. There are a number of moments in the long view of American history when emotions become particularly powerful and politics becomes particularly fraught and polarized and nasty. One of them is the late 1790s. Not a lot of people look back to that period and think that, but that was a really nasty time period where people were out in the street and all kinds of nasty accusations, and Federalists and Republicans each accused the other of trying to destroy America. So there are echoes. Obviously, the pre-Civil War moment is another one of those moments. Polarization, each side saying the other is destroying America. The civil rights fight in the 20th century, again, kind of a moment where people feel really high stakes and they're each accusing the other of trying to destroy what America represents, and this moment. And what those moments all have in common really is, I'm suggesting it in the way I'm describing it, I think there are some moments in time when there are broader issues or broader ideas about America being debated, right? There are some moments in time, and in the late 1790s, part of what they're arguing about is how democratic should American politics be. That's one of these core basic, whoa, that's an important point. Civil War, slavery, right? What's the nation going to look like and how is slavery going to fit into it? Pretty major idea. You know, civil rights, equal rights. Again, you're talking about issues and conflicts that become kind of, what am I trying to say? Flashpoints, that's what I'm trying to say, for an argument to sort of offer all of its implications into view. And we're in that kind of a moment now. So on one hand, I will say there are other moments that have been as polarized and nasty, and actually I'd say the Civil War is worse. So on the one hand, you could say, oh, okay, there have been other moments like this. On the other hand, I think it's important to say, no two play out the same. So what I'm not saying is, oh, we've done this before, it's all going to be okay. This connects with what I said last week, right? It's tempting to say, oh, it's all going to be okay. I don't think we should be saying that. We don't know what's going to happen. We can't assume what's going to happen based on what happened in the past. It is good to know that that's one of the things that's happening in this moment, is each side is accusing the other of that, and that we're really down to kind of a brass tacks basic idea of what people think America is going to be. But I don't think we should move from that to assuming, you know, life is good.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So there are lots of questions about sort of specifics in the document. Do you want to address any of those, or do you want some more broad type questions? I'm going to leave this last couple questions up to you.
Well, you decide, since I don't know what they are.
Okay. So one of the things so Kevin Klein, who, by the way, has been incredibly supportive on Twitter for this whole endeavor, and I just want to thank you publicly for that. He asked an earlier question while you were talking that I think is maybe worth revisiting here, which is there any evidence of these three escalating the quote unquote league to action? And it's he's asking in the context of why in 1970 or 1874 versus while it's actually going on. So is there any evidence of these three sort of escalating this whole concept of call to action?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is kind of yes. There is a point in the document, and they say it very briefly, about letting it be known. After they made their pact, they let it be known that they were willing to fight, I think they say, for sufficient cause. So they're basically saying, not only are we a different kind of Northerner, bring it. Because, you know, if it's the wrong kind of thing, we're going to fight back. And that in and of itself, and even to the point that, you know, we might even be willing to duel, that's something that Southerners wouldn't have heard before. And as they say in this, you know, it has something of an effect, and some Southerners pulled back. Benjamin Franklin Wade, I don't know if it's before or after this pact, when he came to Congress and went to the Senate, he put his gun down on his desk, right? That's a statement. It's like, okay, here I am, Northerner, willing to fight. So in part, they're making the pact and being serious about it and being willing to fight and saying to each other, we pledge to fight to the coffin. That idea and the way that that was communicated at least had something of an impact. And in that sense, it played out. They didn't ever, you know, in the sense that, you know, challenge anyone to a duel. When I went and looked at the moment when this pact was made, it actually was made on an occasion, and they hinted that when someone really insulted one of them in a severe, actually, no, not one of them, someone else, another Republican, in a severe kind of a way. And they sort of said, okay, you know, let's step forward and let's, what does this mean? And what are we going to do? And that doesn't end up being a duel, but they're addressing something specific in addition to speaking more generally. So kind of in the realm of thinking about emotion, sometimes your willingness to fight and how you beam that out, that can have an impact. And you don't have, and that's part of what Southerners are banking on when they're trying to silence anyone who opposes slavery, right? A little violence here, a little intimidation there, and Northerners will know, oh, they're willing to do these horrible things. Southerners aren't going to have to do that all the time. They can bank on intimidation as something that will influence people. It's a brilliant and scary way to conduct politics.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I'll let you end.
Okay. Thank you guys for coming. Obviously, I love talking about this stuff, and this document somehow is close to my heart. So I'm glad I got to talk about it with you. Next week, I won't tell you what we're talking about. I will post a little bit in advance what the document is. We're going to be talking about foundations, forming political foundations, and what documents shows us about what can be planted in those foundations. I won't offer any more now. We're going to be in the 19th century again, but at any rate, I hope that I will see many of you next Thursday, 10 o'clock. Tell other people, you know, I want to spread knowledge. This is making me feel very useful during quarantine, so it's personally useful, but more than that, I'm doing this because I think these insights are really important for people to have at this moment. So spread the word, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.